Welcome to the Health Trip Podcast. My name is Jill Foose. I'm a functional medicine and integrative nutrition health coach. I created this podcast to bring you along as we travel down intriguing, science-packed roads, debunking old medical paradigms and perusing new innovative therapies and modalities with the finest functional medicine doctors, practitioners, and like-minded biohackers while living our best life. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome, everyone. My guest today is Nichole Herms. Nichole is an avid proponent of functional nutritional testing since she began working at Spectracell lab in 2005. In the years since, she's developed training materials for practitioners who wish to integrate functional nutritional diagnostics into their practice, with a special emphasis on the role of micronutrient deficiencies in various diseases. With a bachelor's degree in chemistry and a master's degree in business, she understands both the scientific and the practical aspects of lab testing in today's shifting paradigm of healthcare. Spectracell is CLIA accredited lab that offers a proprietary blood test to healthcare providers and consumers nationwide. That stands for Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments and regulates laboratory testing and requires clinical laboratories to be certified by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services before they can be accepted into human samplings for diagnostic testing. The Spectracell test, also known as the Micronutrient Test, which is their flagship test, is a comprehensive assessment of a patient's nutritional status at the cellular level. Unlike traditional serum, hair, and urine tests, Spectracell's micronutrient testing measures how an individual's white blood cells function in specific nutritional environments. As a result, individual differences in metabolism, age, genetics, health, prescription drug usage, absorption rate, and other factors are taken into consideration when assessing cellular nutritional status. I'm a huge supporter of testing and tracking as many aspects of our health as possible. Finding out as much information as we can on how our body is working or not working in relation to our genetics, our blood work, cellular functioning, nutrition, brain and heart health, and more is essential to finding our unique health equation. In the current conventional medicine paradigm, we are not exposed to such options and thus may not find the precise individual treatment we would benefit from. If you're one of those people who's been dealing with multiple health issues for years, seen multiple doctors for help, and you've tried layers of pharmaceuticals, diets, supplements with not much improvement, this is the podcast for you. One of my favorite tests is their micronutrient test from Spectracell. And I want all of you to understand exactly how this information fits into your overall health and wellness equation. We're going to talk about some of the other unique tests they also offer and how these fit in as well. So welcome, Nichole. That was a mouthful.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so pleased you're here and so excited to dig in. But before we start, I want to just throw out a little medical disclaimer. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice or for making any lifestyle changes to treat any medical conditions in either yourself or others. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to all of my guests on my podcast. All right, let's dig in. I want to know how you ended up at Spectracell Labs and in the world of functional medicine and precision medicine.
Well, it's a little kind of an interesting story. I have a degree in chemistry, and all of the chemical jobs that I went to college in Texas were in Houston, Texas. And so I moved to Houston, Texas after I graduated, and I worked in plastics for a couple of years, which I completely hated. And I liked the chemistry of it and everything, but it was like not in my heart. I didn't really care about making better plastic or whatever. So when I got married, I kind of thought, if I'm going to do something when I have kids, I want to do a job that I completely believe in, that I feel like I'm doing something good for the world, all that sort of, mushy stuff. And so I actually approached Spectracell, and this was actually way back in 2004. I approached them and said, look, here are my credentials. I think what your test is doing is really good. Is there any way I can work for your organization? And so I started, and it grew from there. So I approached the company because I believed in their test before I had even, really had any experience in functional medicine and everything. And then
Well, had you taken their test
No,
before approaching them?
no,
Oh, okay.
I was learning, I kind of started like, wow, this seems really cool. And, I don't remember what happened if I took the test first and approached them. It was like around the same time. But what was really convincing is, you know, basically as soon as I started working there and started working with our clients, which then was just doctors. Now we offer the test straight to consumers. Um, but that's relatively a new thing. We used to only sell to doctors. And we would have certain doctors that used it in their practice that it just totally changed people's lives. And I know that sounds kind of trite or whatever, but it really did, because it was a very, very different approach. And it was particularly good for people who are really dealing with chronic conditions that were just kind of diagnostics hopping or whatever. The traditional medical system sort of just, ate them up and spit them out. And when they would come across some of these functional physicians as a last resort, the micronutrient test really was instrumental in changing things, because it is a totally different approach that is absolutely relevant. And so it didn't take long. It was like, I was already kind of just inspired academically. Wow, this seems really interesting. And then when I started seeing the clinical stories in the the doctors that were using it in their practice, I was sold. I was like, this is really a game changer. And so my role was always sort of, I work in the marketing department, but it's sort of, like the resident nerd in the marketing department, where I would, doctors didn't have time or whatever. So they'd be like, can you just post on this nutrient and this condition and just, help me kind of sift through it all, so I can sort of put the medical literature and the physiological sort of metabolic pathways together with what I'm seeing clinically. And so I helped bridge that gap, and, have been doing it since. So.
Wow, that's a great story, especially being that you didn't even have the test before you showed up at their door and said, let me in and let me do my own magic here. And
well, I'm sure I remember when I first contacted them, I'm sure I was, the same conversation was, hey, how can I work for your organization? And also, where can I get the test? I'm sure, you know what I mean? It was
right.
probably the same time, but
right.
Yeah.
So before we talk about the test, I want to go back to biology class. And I want to talk about cell structure, because I think it's really important for people to understand, especially those of us who didn't like biology, but just a brief glimpse into the cell and how it works, so that we can set up this conversation on how your test works alongside the cells. So what is the magic that happens in a healthy cell versus an unhealthy cell?
Well, the big takeaway would be that in our bodies, all of the metabolic work that makes us tick, whether it's making a neurotransmitter or creating hormones or repairing, detoxifying or whatever, all these processes that happen, they happen inside the cell. They don't, our blood is made up of cells and plasma, and when we think of things in our blood, it's not really floating around loosely in our blood. The stuff that we need, the food, when we eat and we are absorbing nutrients, those need to get into the cell to do what they're supposed to do. So everything happens in the cell. And that's kind of like we sometimes forget that. Not only do we have to absorb it in our gut, but even in the bloodstream, you can have something in the bloodstream that's not really getting into the cells. Everything happens inside the cell. And that's where the magic happens, I guess, if you will. So
yeah, so I want all of the listeners to really pay attention to this, that what Nichole just said, and I'm going to elaborate on it. Even though you think you're eating the optimal human diet, whether you think you're doing it right with a vegan diet, or whether you think you're doing it right with a carnivore diet, or somewhere in between, that does not equate to healthy cells. It doesn't mean that your cells are absorbing all those available nutrients. And I want that to really stick in your mind before we continue on, because that's going to be a common thread throughout the rest of the conversation. So when we don't have a proper functioning healthy cell, what are some of the signs that are associated with that people might think is associated with something else?
Right. Well, first of all, it depends on, what the cell, the nutrient, the cell needs lots of different nutrients. And so depending on which nutrient is not working, the clinical manifestation of that may be different. But really, some of the manifestations can be acute. I mean, a heart attack can actually be kind of, cascading effects of, high blood pressure, which can be due to a new micronutrient deficiency. In other words, the deficiencies can present themselves in a very dramatic way, or in most cases, they are very subtle. In other words, like, for example, we all know, vitamin C, we all kind of know what that vitamin is, and the deficiency, the gross deficiency disease that's associated with that is scurvy, and when you have scurvy, your like connective tissue is like degraded, doesn't work because vitamin C is used in the manufacture of collagen. And so people with scurvy would start losing their teeth and all that kind of stuff. Well, you don't just basically wake up one day and you have scurvy. It takes a very long time for your cells to become so deficient that other metabolic pathways that may overlap that compensate are, it's compromised to the point of such a dramatic manifestation as losing your teeth. But there are more subtle deficiency symptoms that occur for years, sometimes decades. The biggest one is probably fatigue. I mean, fatigue is the body's, manifestation of something's not working right. And of course, you can be fatigued because you didn't sleep well, but did you not sleep well because you don't have the neurotransmitters to get you to sleep, or because your adrenal glands are totally spent because you're stressed out? I mean, whatever the reason, a deficiency can manifest quite acutely and dramatically, or it can manifest very subtly over years. A lack of resistance to infections is absolutely could be attributed to a micronutrient deficiency. Migraines, that's a good example of something that's like acute, that can be a nutrient deficiency, but also chronic. In other words, you have them often, but it's acutely presents as a migraine. So I don't want to say any symptom, but pretty much most symptoms that doctors see in their offices or that people struggle with, whether it's weight gain, the simple things like weight gain or fatigue, lack of sleep, to you get viral infections, or you have a chronic cough or whatever. It's the whole body works on nutrients doing their job, and when they can't, it will manifest eventually.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that list skin rashes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Eczema, psoriasis, and then another huge one for women in midlife, going through menopause or perimenopause or post childbirth, is hair shedding, hair thinning. I'll say that was my story. That is how I found your test, and we'll go into more details on that down the road. But after exhausting all other avenues for myself, going through perimenopause at the time, my functional medicine doctor suggested I take your Spectracell micronutrient test. Let's just see, you're on this carnivore diet, you're eating very bioavailable food and nutrition, but for some reason, it's not connected to my cellular functioning. My cells were still not absorbing all of those nutrients. And that was just eye-opening to me, and which is why I love your test so much. So, but what are some of the main contributors to disease?
Well, it's interesting that you were talking about, you can eat a really healthy diet, which is obviously a subjective thing, but for the sake of argument, let's say you're eating totally like this unprocessed, perfect diet. The thing is, it's not just what you're ingesting. Your genetics may dictate that you need more of a nutrient than someone else. And so that's the beauty about this test. This test, it doesn't really matter why you are deficient. It's like the what. It tells you what you're deficient in. And that could be because you are a pregnant 20-year-old woman with a growing baby, or you're an 80-year-old smoker, or you have a genetic SNP that basically you just have a gene that makes you use up a nutrient faster than others. We don't know necessarily the reason. I mean, sometimes the reasons are obvious. A lot of medications, very, very common medications will deplete nutrients. So sometimes the reasons are obvious, but the thing is, the Spectral test tells you, regardless of the reason, it tells you what is actually going on inside your cells at the moment of the blood draw. And that's what's the beauty of it is it, in that respect, it takes all of your genetics into account, because if your genetics are dictating a lack of absorption or something, or the use of, you need more of a nutrient or something, that would be taken into account into the real life function of your cell, if you will.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you brought up genetic SNPs, which I wanted to talk about. We'll talk about a little more down the road, but I also have the MTHFR C677TT. So I've got the double variant from my mom and my dad, and I just did a podcast on MTHFR. And these genetic SNPs are not something we talk about in the conventional medical paradigm. They just aren't something that is added to the equation or even like thought about. And unless of course you have someone like you or me go into our conventional medical doctor for maybe an annual and say you want to get tested for genetic SNPs, and they kind of look at you like cross-eyed, like what do you mean? But my genetic SNP, my MTHFR, plays a massive role in how my body absorbs or doesn't absorb nutrients. Right. So when I have a double variant, that gene for methylation is only working at a 30% capacity. That's nothing, right? So it takes me every day for the rest of my life, that commitment, that high level of commitment to stay on top of it, or I'm not going to feel good, because I have gone through not feeling good, and I still go through bouts of not feeling good. So we'll talk more about genetic SNPs, but I love that you brought that up. But back to disease, and what are the main contributors that push people towards chronic disease? What do those look like?
Well, if you think about your body is made up of cells, and if the cells aren't working, and we call it, cellular dysfunction or basically cellular dysfunction, if they're not working, the cumulative effect of that is dis-ease, is lack of, your body's not working like it's supposed to be. Our bodies are designed to efficiently detoxify, efficiently repair, to grow and everything. And we have all these physiological systems that allow our bodies to do what they need to do. But for whatever reason, whether, we live in a world where there's a lot of toxins bombarding us and all that, it doesn't mean that we're just doomed to just, die a slow progressive disease death. It just means that we need to be aware of the onslaught to our cells that every day presents, and much of that every day is probably just what people eat. I mean, even eating, a perfect food, whatever, a piece of raw broccoli is pretty much on the healthy list of most diets, right? But even when you're digesting that broccoli, your body will create oxidative stress in digesting food. I mean, just the normal processes that your body goes through will create oxidative stress. Well, there's other systems in place in your cells that help combat that oxidative stress to kind of keep it in check. Now, if there's other things, if you don't have the right nutrients available, especially over the course of a lifetime, your body then maybe can't combat that regular oxidative stress so much. And then you have another onslaught come in, like maybe you get an infection or you get sick or an injury. You injure yourself. Well, if you injure yourself, there's going to be inflammation usually, just cut yourself, there's inflammation. Your body uses nutrients. It's basically the source of its physiological action to heal itself. And when you are lacking that for whatever reason, your body is not working optimally. Your cells are not working optimally. Now, most of us can have some cellular dysfunction, not notice it. We just go about our lives, but we start noticing it as we age, and the thing is, the diagnostics that are available, particularly this test, like give us an insight into fixing that, fixing those deficiencies that we have. That's what this is like next generation diagnostics,
Yeah.
that is basically like we can correct for, you mentioned the MTHFR. MTHFR is the methylene tetrahydrofolate reductase. It's an enzyme used in our cells that it basically serves to methylate, which is kind of like another word for detoxifying certain things in our body. So I have that gene too. I don't have, I'm heterozygous, but I don't, that enzyme in my body does not work as efficiently as someone who has the gene that it works efficiently, has both copies of the efficient gene. And so I know that what that means is I'm predisposed. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's the way things are, but I'm predisposed to be deficient in certain B vitamins, folate or B12. It doesn't mean I'm necessarily going to be, but if I just had that genetic test, I would think, okay, well, there's a predisposition. But this Spectracell micronutrient test is like going one step further, because it's, are you actually deficient in something that you're predisposed to? You might not be, or if you are, you can compensate. You can compensate with supplements or with foods. It's like knowing, it's just a deeper insight into how your cells are working. But back to your question of what predisposes people to disease. This whole the whole notion of cellular function contributing to disease is predicated on the assumption that micronutrient deficiencies cause disease, of which there's overwhelming evidence that is the case. But ironically, in our medical paradigm, that's totally dismissed. By most traditional medical practice, it's, oh, you get everything you need from food. That's completely not true, and we all know that. But this test is takes it to a different level. Like you can see what you are actually deficient in, versus sort of assuming based on genetics, or assuming based on what you ate, or assuming based on symptoms. It's actual cell function. It's a functional cellular test that we do on the person's own cells. So it's a real time, if you will.
Right. And I think it's important to note that even if you have a genetic SNP, it does not mean that it's going to be turned on. It's what Nichole is kind of talking about are the epigenetics, right? So just we're all born with our genes, and our genes are our genes, but it's the epigenetics, which refer to, our nutrition, our lifestyle. Are you working out? Are you sleeping? Are you around environmental toxins? It's all of that can easily turn on or turn off genes. And some genes we don't want turned on, and some genes we don't want turned off. So it's this delicate balance between how we live our life and what our genes are how our genes are functioning for us.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned, the genes. We're obviously born with the DNA we're born with.
Right.
And, when I was in college, which, that was 25 years ago, but still, it was in the recent history, in college, I was kind of taught, you have the gene or you don't. You have this heart disease gene or you don't. And the thing is, that is completely misleading, because we have a lot of there's a lot of genes we all have. It's whether they're expressed, whether they're turned on. It's like the light switch. Are you going to turn on this gene or not? Especially when it comes to cancer, there's a lot of like tumor suppressor genes, and some genes we want to be turned on, and some genes we don't want to be turned on. And guess what turns those on? Nutrients a lot of times will turn genes on or off. Like nutrients interact directly with our DNA. And so that's just another sort of, aspect of how, the traditional medical paradigm is like, oh, you have the gene, oh, you're doomed. And it's completely not the case. You have the gene. Well, how is your gene expressed? What can you do to compensate? It's exciting in a way, because the more we learn, the more we realize our body is actually absolutely adaptable to change it in a good way.
And it also puts a lot of fear in people to go get genetic testing or to have this micronutrient test or other tests. People, some people just don't want to know. And I don't understand that. I want to know all the information because I want to be so precise as I can be in my lifestyle and in the supplements that I take. So often, and I'm sure you've experienced this, I'll hear my friends say, oh, I just read this great article on, this form of magnesium, and I think I'm just going to take it, or I'm going to take this amount of vitamin D3 because I read it in an article here or saw it on a Instagram post here. Well, guess what? Everybody's different. And just because your neighbor or your, workout buddy looks terrific and feels great and is taking, X, Y, and Z supplements does not mean that that's what your body needs. We're all
exactly
different. Right.
Yeah, it's that's one thing that I always mention. First of all, Spectracell doesn't sell supplements. We only do the lab test that is looking at the blood work.
Right.
And really, you're not going to necessarily take the same supplements your whole life. I've done this test on myself through 2 pregnancies. I mean, my needs have changed and my supplements change accordingly.
Absolutely.
But I think that kind of boils down to, a lot of people want the pharmaceutical paradigm is kind of like, we have high blood pressure, here's a pill for that. Here, you've got headaches, here's a pill for that. And, supplements people can kind of fall into that trap of the same thing. Oh, I've got high blood pressure, here's a supplement for that, or whatever. You still have to sort of, take responsibility for learning about your body, if you will. In other words, you don't just get this test and then here's your supplements, correct all of your ails for the rest of your life. You will. The idea is you correct the deficiencies that are reported to you, but as you go through life, other things may become deficient. It's not like you correct it once and you're done forever. It's like taking, you continually want to make sure that your body is replete in nutrients.
Yeah. And I would say the equation for women is so much harder than for men, right? Because we have our when we go through menstruation as a young woman, then we're in our birthing year, our childbearing years, then we're hitting perimenopause and then menopause and then postmenopause. And that roller coaster ride, every twist and turn requires different things.
Yeah. Well, and hormones and nutrients are totally interact. I mean, hormones, some hormones need nutrients just for their structure. Some are regulated by nutrients. Hormones, like for example, estrogen. Estrogen can become toxic. It can be good or bad depending on its form. Well, guess what detoxifies it? Guess what regulates the form it's in? It's nutrients. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, hormones are very fundamental to health for men and women. Women's are just more complicated because we have cycles. It's not just a nice line. It goes up and down monthly and through our life. But still, hormones are so whether it's thyroid, estrogen, steroid hormones, or neurotransmitters, they're all very fundamental to health. Well, those are regulated by micronutrients. Like micronutrients are even more fundamental than hormones, if you will, because they're kind of what's directing hormone synthesis and regulation.
Yes.
Just a good example would be thyroid. We all kind of understand, thyroid and hypothyroidism. Your body sort of slogs along and is not really metabolically working up to par. Well, thyroid hormone is your thyroid makes thyroid hormone, but that thyroid hormone needs to be converted into from T4 to T3. Well, that conversion, it's dependent on minerals. For example, selenium. Selenium, if you're deficient in selenium, you might make thyroid, but you can't convert it to the bioactive form.
Right.
So, traditional tests don't catch this kind of stuff. That's what the Spectracell test is so useful, is because it's comprehensive. There's a lot of nutrients on it, but it's just so fundamental,
Yes.
It's more fundamental than hormones even, which are a pretty fundamental part of human physiology.
Right. And using selenium as a great example is our food is not as nutrient dense as it once was for our, generations back. Our soil is depleted, so our food is depleted. It might look shiny and colorful at the grocery store, but behind closed doors, it is not full of what it used to be back in the day. And so for selenium, you could eat 2 or 3 Brazil nuts a day, but is that really the bioavailable form of selenium when someone is deficient in selenium, or are you better off taking a selenium supplement? So there's all these things to balance. I just had this conversation on the MTHFR podcast about, can we be purists? Can we just live off the food that's provided to us from Mother Nature, whether it's plant-based or animal-based? And to me, the answer is a big no, because it's not as nutrient dense, and it's impossible to eat all the nutrients you need in all the amounts you need on a daily basis. It's just impossible.
That is a great question. Really, if you can get someone to go live off the land for 6 months, completely off the land, I would love to get their Spectracell before and after. It's kind of a moot point, because you're exactly right. Selenium is a good example. There's the only reason why Brazil nuts have a lot of selenium is because there's a lot of selenium-rich soil in Brazil. But our plants get the minerals from soil, and so if we, that's a whole nother sort of subject. But if we don't treat our soil correctly, doesn't matter if we're eating the tomato off of that great vine, if that vine is in soil that's has been leached out of minerals, it's just not as nutrient dense as it was once upon a time. But even then, if someone's really a purist, that's a pretty big, ginormous first step, because no one really is a purist. I certainly love real food, but I'm still getting my food from the grocery store, and so I don't know when it was picked. Sometimes we have a lot of farmers markets. I live in Colorado, which is nice. But that's a whole nother thing. And when it comes to animal foods, you really need to know, what did that animal eat? Because that is absolutely critical to whether that animal food is going to be inflammatory or not,
Right.
And so whether we can get all of our nutrients from food, theoretically, I guess, yes, but practically, I just don't see it in this day and age. But it's a moot point, because really, if you are living off the land completely, and catching your own fish in this beautiful unadulterated stream, and growing your own vegetables, well, you're probably feeling pretty good anyway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that's always the question is
it's important to really acknowledge that. I have a lot of clients that come to me, and they have this, they show up and they have this seemingly wonderful diet, but they're really not feeling optimized. And why is that? And so we always talk about macronutrients. We talk about carbs, fats, and proteins a lot, but your flagship test is called the Micronutrient Test. So I think it will benefit the listeners to talk about why micronutrients, what are micronutrients, and what is the role they play in our cellular health.
Well, that's a good point, because macronutrients are, like you said, proteins, fats, carbohydrates. There's good and bad of both. But if macronutrients are like the big, whatever the big, foods we ingest, micronutrients are like the chemicals in the food that cause our bodies to be able to work. But in simpler terms, micronutrients are vitamins, minerals, antioxidants, amino acids, fatty acids. They're basically the chemicals in our bodies. Mm-hmm. Some micronutrients kind of have dual roles. Vitamin D is a micronutrient. It's a vitamin, but really it's also a hormone. It's kind of a pro-hormone. It acts like a hormone in our tissues. Minerals, we all kind of understand a mineral is, zinc is just simply a mineral, on the periodic table, but zinc actually catalyzes like over 100 reactions in our body. So, like for everything from like, an enzyme that's going to help, digest food, or an enzyme that's going to create energy in our mitochondria or whatever. I mean, all these use chemicals, and these chemicals are the micronutrients. The micronutrients are the vitamins and minerals that make us tick, basically.
Yes, and all foods have micronutrients, whether you're a carnivore or a vegan, they are in all foods in just different ratios and different types.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention, you make a good point about the foods. It's like we can eat a healthy food. You eat some broccoli, it's going to have a lot of minerals and all this good stuff. But there's also foods, if you want to call them foods, or things that we ingest that, like if you drink a soda, soda is not going to have any nutrients, but it's also not just neutral, because your body is going to use up nutrients, detoxifying that or metabolizing that. So like if you eat a really healthy something, but you eat something that is not healthy, that's going to deplete you because it needs the nutrients to metabolize it. You got to remember that too. A lot of people think, oh well, I'm eating good stuff, so that's taking care of it. No, everything that we ingest is going to have either a positive or and so unfortunately that makes us accountable for everything that we ingest. It seems daunting, but the real truth is it's actually quite empowering. When you realize if you were a purist and eating really unprocessed, unadulterated food, it's life-changing.
Absolutely.
Most people do not do that, not even for a short period. What if you lived your life like that? Are you familiar with Dr. Weston Price's book?
Yes.
I feel like that book should be taught in medical school. It's a book about a man who went around in the 30s around the world and looked at indigenous cultures that actually did live off the land. Their diets were totally different. Some of them lived by the ocean, and so they had a lot of seafood. Some of them lived in like Canada, where they ate like native cranberries and deer. Their diets were very different, but the thing that they didn't have, none of them had chronic disease. In fact, they didn't even have. He was a dentist. They didn't even have dental caries or cavities. And the thing is, what was so interesting about his book is it was about the time when Europeans were kind of creating trading posts, and they would set up these trading posts where they would trade white flour, sugar, and jellies to the people who were eating off the land, and they saw these chronic diseases develop in one generation. It's an amazing book. It's it was written in the 30s, but anyway, it just goes to show that eating real food completely is a very healing thing, but you can't just eat real food and bad food, because everything that you ingest is going to have a metabolic effect on your body. So
right.
It's like I said, it can be daunting, but it's also extremely empowering when you really see the effects of it.
Right. Always eating a whole food diet is going to be better than a processed diet, but that still doesn't mean, we go back to that initial conversation, it just still doesn't mean we're absorbing all those amazing nutrients, these little chemical messengers that talk between the cells and handle all that stuff in our body, all that good stuff.
One of the good news is also, though, that our body has like this these amazing like sort of systems of redundancy built in. So like I said, zinc is a catalyst to like over 100 metabolic reactions in the body. Well, there's other, like if you are deficient in something, your body has these mechanisms in place to compensate that for up to a point. So in other words, if you can can replete your cells. They're, it's not like, one bad, Christmas dinner and all this work is undone. Your body, it holds on to those nutrients. I mean, there's a lot of, for this test, we do it on lymphocytes, which the lymphocytes that we do it on are peripheral lymphocytes. They have lifespan of 4 to 6 months. So you don't become deficient overnight. You can't replete that deficiency overnight. But once you do replete the deficiency, it's not as fragile as you may think. In other words, your body has if you really replete your body, it will, there's mechanisms in place that it will stay healthy. In other words,
I know, yeah. I understand what you're saying. However, the body is so smart that it will prioritize what really needs to be done to survive. Yeah. And so let's just use menopausal hair thinning for an example. Like if your thyroid is off, if your hormones are off, if you're on hormone replacement therapy, if you have a genetic SNP, such as you and I, different, but we both have them. If you have an autoimmune disease, if your lifestyle is poor nutrition, your body's going to prioritize where it's going to use these macro and micronutrients, especially those micronutrients, because there's only so much energy. There's only so much to go around. So we don't need hair to survive. It looks great, but we don't need it to survive. And so your body is going to utilize the nutrients it has in the amount it has to do all the things it has to do to keep you going, keep your metabolism going, keep you, your temperature control, all these, your heart beating, your brain functioning. And it's going to say, you know what, I don't have enough left for the hair follicles. So I'm just going to pull the plug on the hair follicles, and we're going to deal with everything else we need to deal with. And so it was that moment in my life when I turned 50. And I've been into functional medicine and holistic healing, since I was 16. So a really long time. And I raised my 5 kids this way. But it was when I turned 50 that everything just started to spiral down for me. And I'm always on top. At least I always think I'm on top of myself, right? And that's when my functional medicine doctor said, you know what, let's see what's going on at a cellular level here and see what's happening. And like I said earlier, it was astonishing to see that with the diet I ate, the nutrients I was providing my body, that my cells were I think I was functionally deficient in maybe 10 major vitamins and minerals, and maybe another 12 borderline deficiencies. Yeah. So let's talk about the micronutrient test. Let's talk about when, such as myself, when you get to that point where you've exhausted blood work, you're every 3 months, you're looking at your thyroid, because I only have half a thyroid. Every 3 months, I'm looking at my sex hormones. I'm trying to get all these puzzle pieces in line with each other to work harmoniously together. Mm-hmm. And I'm still having my hair shed. What is going on? So take it from there.
Well, let me, I'll just kind of give an overview of how the test works. Basically,
yes, perfect.
It's called the Micronutrient Test, and you take blood, it's whole blood that has to be taken through a vein, because that blood needs to be overnighted to the lab in Texas, because we need to receive the blood within 24 hours. And the reason why is because when we get that blood, we take the lymphocytes, which are white blood cells that are kind of the superstars of your immune system and systemic health. But we take those white blood cells and isolate them. And then the first step of the test is we take those white blood cells and expose them to the perfect nutritional environment. And that is the heart of the test. It's called the Cfbi Medium, which is basically a culture medium that was developed at the University of Texas way back in the 80s. And this was based on research from Dr. Roger Williams, who's the father of he coined the term biochemical individuality. But I guess my point in saying that is this is not just some test that we just kind of invented. This was developed in academia, the University of Texas, in the 80s and early 90s. and then it was commercialized in the 90s to where doctors could order it. So we take these lymphocytes and grow them in this called CFBI, for Clayton Foundation Biochemical Institute, where it was invented like 30 years ago. This medium is like all the nutrition needed to optimize lymphocyte growth. Okay, so we grow your cells in that. We're taking your lymphocytes and we grow them in the best possible environment they can be in. And we take that measurement, and that is basically the first step. And that measurement is called your immunodex, which is the term for the type of assay is it's a lymphocyte proliferation assay, but it's basically measuring how strong your lymphocytes can grow, like how healthy they are in the best possible world. Now, we take those lymphocytes and we subject them to a media that has basically like one nutrient removed. So we'll say vitamin B1, for example. We take that lymphocyte. Now we know the best possible growth rate it can have. Now, let's say we expose it to an environment where there's 0 B1 available for that lymphocyte to use in its attempt to proliferate or grow. If that lymphocyte grew the exact same rate, then it is not deficient in B1 because it had the B1 inside the cell in order to perform all the metabolic work it needed to proliferate or grow or basically clone itself. That's what lymphocytes' job is, to basically clone themselves when needed. So if that lymphocyte did not grow, if it grew exactly the same without B1 as it did in the perfect environment, then great, it's got B1 in it and it's not deficient in B1. However, if that lymphocyte growth rate changes and suffers, and now that lymphocyte cannot grow, it cannot proliferate, it can't clone itself very well because it's like, it's because it didn't have the B1 available to do that. And so it would be deficient, it'd be considered deficient in B1. So this is done for all of the nutrients in the test. There's 31 nutrients tested, and then there's 4 metabolic tests that are unique in themselves. So for 31 different nutrients, we are comparing the growth rate of the lymphocyte in the perfect nutritional environment to an environment that is not subjected to the specific nutrient which we're testing. So that is a true functional test. In other words, we are not measuring how much B1 is in the cell or even B1 is in the blood, because any measurement of that would be like just basically mass per unit volume, which is what serum testing, you get a vitamin D test, it's measured in mass per unit volume. Our test is reported in percentage because it is comparing the percentage, it's comparing the growth rate in the perfect environment, in perfect nutritional environment, compared to the growth rate in the environment without said nutrient. And the percentage is the difference in growth rate because it's a ratio of growth rates. It's reported in a percentage, which is a ratio. And so we repeat this for the 31 nutrients, and that is how we determine if the cell is functionally deficient in any of the nutrients that we test. So it's not measuring how much of the nutrients there, it's measuring how well your cell is using the nutrient, which is really what's important.
And what's the difference between, I have my test right here, actually, my recent one. And so what is the difference between functional deficiencies and borderline deficiencies?
It's just the degree in which they're deficient. So functional deficiency on our report, they're both functional deficiencies, I guess, in the truest sense of the term. But the ones that we report, the report breaks them up into functional deficiencies and borderline. The functional ones are just more deficient. They're more severe, a more severe deficiency. Borderline is kind of like they're not really deficient, but if you don't keep an eye on them, they could definitely be pushed into the deficiency. And actually, I would say we just started reporting the borderline probably within the last 10 years. We used to not report the borderline because it was so, some doctors thought it was so much information that they didn't want the borderline information. They're like, I just want the gross, the more severe deficiencies, and I want to work on that with my patient. But the truth is, the borderline deficiencies, it's worth noting because, like I said, they're on their way to becoming deficient. So it's a lot of information, but it's we include them because they are important. The good news is when you get a report and it shows you, you have these deficiencies and then these other nutrients are like in your borderline area, what we've noticed is sometimes when you correct one deficiency, others sort of like get better. In other words, it's just like your body has redundancy when it's lacking something to kind of compensate. When you replete something, it's almost like you're saving the nutrients in a way. It's like you replete something and then other nutrients just tend to sometimes get better. In other words, so you have like 8 deficiencies and we kind of look at the report, report by report, but if you correct like 4 or 5 of those, other ones will tend to get better. That we've noticed that in many cases.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, it can be overwhelming when you get the results back, right? Especially if you've never done this test before and you just look at all of this information and you're like, what do I do? Like, where do I even start? But I love how your company gives suggested supplementation as well. I mean, you absolutely need to be working with your primary care physician, your functional medicine doctor, your integrative doctor, whoever it is. This is something you should definitely have a partnership with someone to help you make sure you're taking the proper dose of whatever the micronutrient deficiency is that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ideally, it's great if a person works with their physician when they're getting our test. That's why, like I said, we've sold the test. The test was ordered by doctors. For most of our history, and I would say in the last couple of years, we're now offering it to consumers, and that's just kind of like a byproduct of the fact that people want to do their own labs. We don't take insurance anymore. We don't submit to insurance because it was such a headache. Some insurances pay for our insurance used to pay for this test. Sometimes it didn't. It was just it was a lot of doctors that were using our test were just frustrated by the whole insurance component, and we were like, look, it's a great test. We're just not doing insurance anymore. And so because of the not having to deal with insurance, we can just, people can order it directly, and people want to, that's kind of, especially, after COVID, and people are sort of like taking more interest in their own health and their own labs or whatever. So, we do sell to direct to consumers, absolutely. And so as a result, we do put suggested supplementation on the report, although I'll be honest, it's very conservative. We put very conservative dosage. Doctors that use our test on their patients will often supplement in much higher dosages because they're experienced in it, they know what they're doing, and they're not afraid of it. Because when you supplement in pharmacological dosages, that's what drives sometimes those nutrients into the cell, or it drives the reaction to replete the cell. But we can't put these, super physiological dosages on the report. So the report is actually very conservative. You can look in the literature and look at trials done on supplements and the dosages. Sometimes the dosages are much higher or whatever, but we say, it's just suggested supplementation because we're a lab. We can't be the doctor, telling the patient exactly what to do. We're just providing the information and the blood work. But we also want to give you as much information as possible so that you can replete your cells. You're not just armed with, I'm deficient in this. I don't know what to do about it now.
Right. And one of the positives that are associated with this whole pandemic is that many functional medicine doctors are now working online. So if you are out there and you live in a rural area, this test can be shipped to you. You can just go to your local hospital, your local doctor, have the blood drawn. It comes in a kit. It's very easy. You get your blood drawn, ship it in overnight. It comes with a addressed envelope or a box to go back.
All the shipping and
it's all there. Right. And now, there's no more reason not to connect with a functional medicine doctor or some like-minded practitioner online, because we can get to anybody anywhere now. Right. So many times I have had clients in the past come to me that they live in a rural area and they just don't have access to all of this. And so I think it's wonderful that your company now is open to sending it direct to the consumer. One of the really interesting parts of your test is the carbohydrate metabolism component.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a bit, because I found that just so incredible, and I want to share that with my listeners.
Yeah. So this full Spectracell test, there's 31 nutrients, which are like the vitamins and minerals, many of which we've heard of. Some of them, a lot of people haven't heard of, like asparagine or cysteine or whatever, but those are all the nutrients. And then there's 4 tests that are metabolic tests. I mentioned one of them, which is the first step of the test. It's called Immunodex, and that is measuring your cell immune function, which is totally underrated because it is, your cells the lymphocyte function is absolutely what helps you resist infections, including COVID. I mean, it's an underrated aspect of the test. So there's one that's immune function, one that's measuring your cells' resistance to oxidative stress, how well your cells can handle oxidative stress. And then there's 2 metabolic tests that assess carbohydrate function, and they're really interesting. One of them is called the glucose insulin test. It's not a glucose, nor is it an insulin test. A glucose test, people intuitively know you're measuring blood, your blood glucose levels in your blood, or insulin. If you get your insulin, it's like I said, it's measured in mass per unit volume. Our test, however, is measuring, it's actually like a measure of how well insulin is functioning in your cell. In other words, we take the lymphocyte, and if your cell is not using insulin very well, like because it's resistant or it's insensitive to insulin, but the lymphocyte is not utilizing what insulin is there, then it reports as a deficiency in glucose insulin interaction. But what this really means is that your cells are not using insulin efficiently. So we see this test is very common in people with metabolic syndrome, and it's almost like it's a earlier test than some of the pre-diabetic markers that are out there. What's interesting about the glucose insulin test, so it's a measure of basically how well your cells can use insulin, which is really important because type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes, you can't make any insulin. Type 2 diabetes, you make a ton of it, but your cells can't use it because they're like resistant to it.
Right.
So this is helping, are your cells sensitive to insulin? What we've noticed is if you have a deficiency in this, a lot of times there's other deficiencies in nutrients that when corrected, this automatically corrects. For example, chromium. Chromium is huge in your body's ability to metabolize carbohydrates. If you're deficient in chromium, chromium is actually part of the glucose tolerance factor, which helps metabolize carbohydrates. So if you're deficient in chromium and you correct that deficiency, a lot of times your insulin function will automatically improve. So this part of the Spectracell test is sort of like a unique metabolic test. And what we've noticed is often, like I had mentioned, the nutrients take a while to replete. When I say a while, I mean like a couple of months. It takes a while to really drive those nutrients into the cell to replete the function. But the glucose insulin test tends to correct in the matter of a few weeks versus a few months. It's interesting. It just corrects faster. It's more pliable, if you will. So that is one of the 2 carbohydrate function tests, is measuring how sensitive your cells are to insulin, which is hugely important to know. And just as an aside, we've had people who've done this test that run a marathon and they get this test and they're totally fit, as in they can run a marathon and stuff, but their glucose insulin test is deficient. And they're like, what? And the thing is, your cells can be, deficient, or they're not really that sensitive, even if you're performing. In other words, it's a matter of time before that turns into some kind of pre-diabetic marker, if you will. So this is it's just a really good early indicator of insulin sensitivity. The other one is called a fructose sensitivity test. And fructose, it basically is not a measure of fructose deficiency. It's a measure of your cell's ability to utilize fructose. So when fructose is used in the cell, it actually, fructose is metabolized in the liver, and fructose, when you ingest fructose, it does not actually directly impact your blood glucose. It does indirectly, but not directly. And if you are deficient on this fructose sensitivity aspect of the Spectracell test, what that means is your bodies cannot handle the fructose that that you're either ingesting or that's there. And a lot of people think, we get this all the time, they're like, okay, does that mean I need to stop eating apples? You know, and the thing is, it does not mean you need to stop eating apples. What it means is there might be some things that are being ingested that people don't really realize that have fructose. I mean, obviously, fructose, corn syrup has a lot of fructose. High fructose corn syrup has a ton of fructose. I mean, and we're talking like copious amounts from a cellular metabolic standpoint. Even just like juices. Juices are really high in fructose. People think, oh, it's just apple juice. How is that different? An apple is totally different. An apple is got fiber. It's totally metabolized differently. But another interesting thing is, like we've had people, that don't eat juices, they don't drink sodas or whatever, but they may show up as a deficiency in their fructose sensitivity. And one thing that's high that's sometimes underrated is wine, because wine tends to increase, has a lot of fructose from the grapes, but also sorbitol is sometimes used to preserve wines, and also like sorbitol and a lot of sugar alcohols are used in keto foods. People that are on a keto diet, they're like, I'm not eating any carbohydrates. How could I be fructose sensitive? The thing is, a lot of these sugar alcohols are metabolized in the liver in a way that's compromises your ability to use fructose. And so sometimes sorbitol and sugar alcohols can induce induce a sensitivity to metabolizing fructose. So it's not just like, these two metabolic tests that are on carbohydrate metabolism tell you so much on your cell capacity, just so much more than just, a glucose test or whatever. But anyway,
absolutely,
I explained it.
No, you did, and it's making me think about my fifth kid, who's a professional hockey player, and I had him do this test because he was complaining that, and he eats super healthy, and he's super on top of it, supplements based on his blood, all that. And he was complaining that he was starting to feel very tired and run down, and he just was like, I'm eating right. Why am I not having the energy? And so we know our two forms of energy in the body are either glucose or ketones or fatty acids, right? And so obviously, if he's going to be eating a lot of healthy carbohydrates, meaning like sweet potatoes, yams, things of that nature, and his fructose sensitivity and his glucose insulin interaction on the micronutrient test were very compromised. So oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say about the fructose. Another thing that's interesting about that is the pathway that the cells use to metabolize fructose. I forgot what it's called, like the phosphate pathway or whatever. It also uses vitamin C, and so and we see this with athletes. Like there's a lot of professional athletes that use this test. Those, obviously these people are fit and they're eating better than most Americans. We're not talking about the 60-year-old diabetic,
right?
But they have these deficiencies. Well, their bodies are, performing at such a level that they may be using up. They may be needing more nutrients. If their Spectracell says their cells are deficient, doesn't mean they're not fit or they're not doing something right. It's just their game is so high that they need more. You know what I mean? If their cells had that nutrient, their cells would work even better, if you will.
Yes.
And so with fructose, sometimes some of the deficiencies we see with fructose are vitamin C is a big one, and copper. And and we've noticed if you have a vitamin C and a copper deficiency with the fructose, and you correct those, the fructose sensitivity corrects, and your body becomes more capable of metabolizing fructose.
Yeah.
So that's another thing. These aren't just nutrients in isolation. population. We're looking at the big picture. We're looking at 31 nutrients plus 4 metabolic tests that tell you a ton of information about your cells, you know?
Right.
And your healthy lifestyle is just one aspect of it, you know? I mean, if you're an athlete, you are taxing your body, especially if you're an elite athlete. We see that, you know, this is a way to make your cells capable of achieving, you know, more than, you know, than without it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's such a great test for so many different types of people, and you don't have to be sick or have an obvious health issue to go get this test, right? So this test is for, you know, sports performance. You list this on your website. People who have neurological disorders like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, ADHD, mood disorders, chronic fatigue, osteoporosis, fertility issues, weight issues, and cancer patients as well. So it really covers a full spectrum of people and health conditions.
Absolutely. And the reason is, if nutrients, micronutrients, are so fundamental to every process that they would affect so many different processes in the body. I mean, we have, you know, pediatricians that use this in practices with kids that have ADHD and autism, you know, because there's a lot of neurotransmitter function that is dictated by nutrient availability. And you know, from elite athletes to, you know, people on chemotherapy, you know, chemotherapy obviously is extremely taxing on the cells. This is we have oncologists that use this. It's just, it's so fundamental that what we're testing, the cell's ability to use nutrients, is so fundamental that it applies to so many different, you know, areas of health and performance, really.
Yeah, you know, and there's a term that is new out there called precision nutrition and also precision medicine. And precision nutrition is all about finding as much information out about how your cells work, how your body's working, and tailoring your diet, your lifestyle, your supplements to that.
Right.
And it's so very precise. And again, it's not your neighbors and it's not your workout partner's equation, it's your equation. What are the most common deficiencies you see in this test?
I would say zinc and magnesium are huge. I mean, probably, you know, maybe 20% of samples come in have deficiency of zinc and magnesium, and maybe because they're just used in so many different reactions in the body, but those are the most common minerals. We see a lot of vitamin D deficiency, and then probably some of the B vitamins. But I would say, you know, zinc, magnesium, and vitamin D are probably the most common. Actually, and so we also have a part of it is the Spectrox, which is, you know, we talked about the 4 metabolic tests. One was the fructose sensitivity, one was the glucose insulin interaction, one was the Immunodex. The Spectrox is basically taking the cell and seeing how well it can withstand oxidative stress. That one is extremely deficient. And if you think about it, that's basically, I mean, your cell's ability to totally withstand an onslaught, that we measure with the Spectrox, and that is often deficient. The Immunodex and the Spectrox are often deficient, especially in older people. And when I say older, I mean like over 50.
Yeah. I'm not surprised about magnesium or vitamin D.
Mm-hmm.
Wait, but in terms of magnesium, I have a quick question.
Yep.
There's so many different forms of magnesium to take, and they all target different things. But you're just testing for magnesium in general.
Yes. We're how you supplement. I mean, there's different, you know, forms. Usually with the mineral, it's, you know, good chelated to amino acid. But we're not testing like, you know, magnesium glycinate or magnesium syrup. We're not testing a form of it. We're just testing elemental magnesium.
Okay, got it. Okay. All right. So we've talked about MTHFR a lot. So I don't want to dive any more into that, but you do have an MTHFR test.
Yes.
Right. But one of your other tests is super cool, and it's the one on telomeres.
Yeah.
So can you explain what telomeres are and why they're so important?
Yeah, the telomere test is, well, telomeres are the caps on your DNA. They're kind of like the caps on your shoelaces.
Yep.
DNA is like this double helix of twisted genetic code, and the ends would completely unravel and be all jacked up if they didn't have these telomeres that kind of protect them, like those ends of your shoelaces. And so when a cell divides, there's a small bit of the telomere that gets shorter. It's like the telomere has a certain length, and once the cell divides, it gets a little shorter, and then it gets a little shorter the next time it divides, the next time it divides, and then when it gets to a certain point, the cell says, I can't divide anymore, I'm going to go ahead and die. It's programmed cell death, and that cell dies. And so ideally, you want your telomeres to be long, because then they're going to protect your cells from dying. And when your cells die, your tissues die, and you become aged.
Yes.
Whether it's epithelial cells or heart cells or whatever. So we measure telomeres. It's called the Telomere Test, and it just measures the length of the telomeres, the average length of your telomeres on white blood cells, and it's a pretty exciting, kind of a sexy, kind of cool test. But it's basically measuring how well your cells are aging.
Right. So it can give you a glimpse into your biological age versus your chronological age, which is your number in years that you've been alive, but your biological age might be higher, or hopefully it's lower.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I'm 48, and I do my telomere testing every year. And I'm a little younger biologically than my cells. But it's interesting because the telomere test, it's an interesting and exciting number to know. And the first question we always get is, well, how do I make my telomeres longer? And there's a difference between shortening or decreasing the rate at which your telomeres decrease. In other words, the telomere attrition rate, making that not as dramatic, and lengthening telomeres. And we don't do either. We just measure the telomeres. But what ideally you want to do is decrease the attrition rate. There are some, research that wants to elongate telomeres, but you got to remember there's only there's the enzyme that elongates telomeres is called telomerase. So it seems like, okay, this would be the greatest enzyme ever, right? If I took this enzyme, all my cells are going to live forever. The thing is, there's only three types of cells in our bodies that have telomerase. One is stem cells, which we know are really good. One is like sperm and egg cells, and the other are cancer cells. Cancer cells also express telomerase, which is what makes them immortal. And so we don't, we tell you your telomere length, but we don't necessarily say do whatever you can to increase telomeres. In other words, if there's telomerase out there, you don't necessarily want to take that, because there's a reason why our cells stop dividing. If they get old and screwed up or whatever, you don't want that cell to keep dividing and create those mutations,
right?
Create a tumor or whatever. And so telomeres is such an interesting thing because it's such a new area of research or whatever. We do the telomere testing, but guess what helps reduce the rate of attrition in telomeres? Nutrients. Like we have a whole set of research that shows if you're deficient in this, it erodes your telomeres. If you replete this, it helps preserve your telomeres. So again, it just goes right back to the fundamental notion of micronutrients make everything work and protect things in your body, including
what nutrients help support lengthening or
reduced telomere attrition?
Yeah.
Vitamin D is a big one. Vitamin D has an effect on telomeres. A lot of the B vitamins, any vitamin that is involved in methylation, like we were talking about. Methylation is a process in our bodies that is used to turn on and off genes. It's also used sort of like detoxifying. It's also a physiological process that is important into neurotransmitter synthesis. any nutrient that involves in methylation can potentially affect telomeres, which would include folate, which is vitamin B9, vitamin B6, vitamin B12, serine. Serine is an amino acid that is really important to methylation. So a lot of these nutrients definitely have an impact on telomeres. And you know, we haven't done a study where we look at telomeres and then nutrient deficiencies. I mean, that would be so interesting. But there is a lot of research that shows that nutrient deficiencies can absolutely erode your telomeres. Thus, correcting them can help preserve them.
Yeah, that's the one test I haven't taken yet, but that's on my list for 2022 for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to be 54 in February, and I'm just super curious as to what my seemingly biological age is after doing, you know, after spending almost 4 decades trying to practice biohacking on myself. Yeah, so super interesting.
What's interesting is that, you know, the biggest thing that can erode telomeres is stress. And I know that sounds like a kind of a catch-all, but physiologically,
yeah,
you know, stress, there's nutrients like serine, like I just mentioned, the amino acid serine is used in the methylation pathway, but serine actually also has another role of it buffers the physiological impact of the stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. And so these nutrients, it's everything has like these indirect pathways. Serine can help buffer the stress response from a physiological standpoint. And lo and behold, research says serine helps protect telomeres too, you know? So there's just, I feel like we're in the infancy of nutrition research in terms of just, there's so many interacting, you know, metabolic pathways and everything. And you know, most medical research is more geared towards pharmacological interventions or surgical interventions, but the nutritional interventions are nothing short of amazing, really. You know, they are very fundamental to our cell health.
Yeah. Would you say that the micronutrient test is a good test to take for leaky gut? Is there a correlation?
Well, I say yes, but so the micronutrient test, I think leaky gut, you know, a lot of people have leaky gut where basically they're, you know, the epithelial cells kind of just have little gaps in them in their gut, and so they absorb things they're not supposed to, and maybe have some immune responses as a result. The micronutrient test is appropriate because, number one, if you have leaky gut, you necessarily will have inflammation. You're going to be having an inflammatory response. Your body is going to, an autoimmune response is by definition really an inflammatory response. Your body is saying this protein or carbohydrate or whatever this is does not belong here. I'm going to launch a response to combat it or clean it up or whatever. And that inflammatory response is taxing on your cells. It is also needs nutrients to, it causes damage to cells, and that damage needs to be repaired with nutrients. And a lot of these, like the antioxidants that our body uses to repair damage, are nutrient dependent. They're completely dependent on nutrients. And so if you have leaky gut, you have inflammation, which means you need to know what you're deficient in so that you can correct that and help your cells fight the leaky gut, if you will, or the inflammatory response that results. But another sort of, on the other hand, a lot of people who have leaky gut, we've seen in a lot of people who have sort of inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's, or just like a lot of gut issues, you know, whether they have celiac or not or whatever, they're just feeling gut issues. A lot of them are deficient in glutamine, and glutamine is an amino acid that is used in the line to help the lining of the intestines remain the intestines, you know, remain in the integrity of the lining so that it does not get leaky, if you will. And so the Spectral test will sometimes, it will report what your cells are deficient in. Now, whether they're deficient in that because you're not absorbing the nutrients or because you need more of that nutrient like glutamine to repair the gut, or because you're have an inflammatory response, we don't know. It just tells you what you're deficient in, and correcting those deficiencies is going to help your body
yes.
Combat that leaky gut. It doesn't necessarily, it's not the reason for the leaky gut, at least.
But there is a connection.
Yeah, there's absolutely a connection. In other words, the leaky gut might be because you're, you have celiac and you're eating gluten, you might have leaky gut. But from a physiological standpoint, maybe the reason is because you don't have enough glutamine to repair that, or because you don't have, the antioxidants to combat that stress. I mean, there's
a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the micronutrient test is absolutely absolutely good for leaky gut or any kind of inflammatory gut issue, which most of us have,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I do. I know I do. And I work on that every day. And your test has really, really helped me. I actually, we're coming to a close, but one of the wonderful things about your test is that you can repeat it. Yeah. And so I took it about 6 months ago, and I just took it again, and I haven't gotten the results back yet, but I'm really curious to see if the protocol I followed with my functional medicine doctor shows improvements.
I mean, that's the goal. The goal is to get the test and develop a repletion program to correct the deficiencies. And then ideally, when you retest, those deficiencies are corrected or at least improved. And the test is reported, qualitatively as in deficient or not deficient, but also quantitatively. We give you, remember, we
percentages.
Report it in percentage. So you can kind of quantitatively see if you're improving. But that, the goal is to correct the deficiencies.
Yes.
The purpose of the test, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Nichole, I have a couple simple questions left. Well, maybe they aren't so simple, but more fun. What are 3 things someone can do to start today to support their cellular function?
Well, of course, get the Spectral test, but that goes without saying.
Right.
Honestly, I'll have to be honest. I'm a big proponent of fasting. I think fasting is a very underrated method of healing. It's worth investigating for so many things, especially like you were mentioning gut issues. I mean, I think fasting is totally underrated. So I would say that, and I guess maybe also just learning a little bit about what's in your food. There's a little bit of a ignorance is bliss, because sometimes when you learn about what's in your food, it's like, oh my gosh, I wish I didn't know about our food supply. But it really is, I think, important to just understand what certain ingredients really are, and just understand be a little more connected to the source of their food.
Yes. It's one of the things I work with all of my clients on reading labels, reading ingredients, and properly reading a nutrition label, and being your own detective. And it's such an important skill to pass down to your kids, because your kids are not always going to be in your house, right? One day they're going to grow up and go off into the world. And my kids, I have trained them. They all know exactly how to read a label, and super important skill.
Good for you.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome.
Yeah. Now that they're older, they're 18 to 27, the questions that they ask me, or when I get to see them living their life and eating healthy, I'm like, oh, wow, they actually listened to me. Like, I didn't think they were, and they pretended like they weren't, but they actually are.
Yeah. I have 3 sons that are aged 12 to 17. And, I do a lot of cooking, because you have to really, I can't just talk the talk. I mean, if I really believe this, I spend a lot of time in the kitchen. And, I sometimes wonder, when they're 18, they move out to college, maybe they're going to go eat fast food and just completely whatever. But I think some of it has sunk in. I just feel like it's, it has.
Oh yeah. My kids all live on their own, and they have the best kitchen little gadgets. They've got the air fryers and the crock pots. I mean, I have 4 boys and a girl, and a few of my boys, they do all the shopping, all the meal prepping, they look up recipes. It just warms my heart. I absolutely love it. Yeah.
Well,
all right.
People think, food can be such a source of stress when you're like, overwhelmed by how toxic our food are or whatever, but really I love food, and food really, natural food tastes delicious. Use, spices. I love using spices or whatever. And so it is, I'm not like, don't enjoy food and shun it or whatever. Food is a source of joy in our house. It's
absolutely
just a time-consuming source of joy. I mean, we have to invest in that,
Yes.
It's absolutely a reward.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about lifestyle here. You have got to make a commitment, and to take a test like yours, it costs money. This is not a $50 test. And so go into it with the attitude that whatever results you get, you're going to commit to a protocol and you're going to see it through, because I see so many people quit after like 30 days. It's just too hard. I can't do it, but it's really about working on that mindset, working on stress reduction techniques, and really visualizing what your life could feel and look like when you follow such protocol and you have all that goodness, right? Yeah, so that's pretty cool. Last question. What are your top 3 foods or supplements?
Well, my supplements, I mean, I do change my supplement protocol according to my micronutrient, but there are certain foods that I really like. Fermented kraut. Like I just feel like it's a great source of,
prebiotic.
Yeah. And I make my boys eat some fermented kraut every once in a while. What I've noticed about kids is if you just make them eat it, like eventually after maybe like 10 or 20 times, they just like it suddenly. So I think, I do like fermented kraut. I think it's just a good healing food. Bone broth, I do like to have some bone broth, and I'm talking about like a food that I feel like is healing, but a food that's fun. I love nuts and fruit. I mean, I do, I think those are just great snacks. So, yeah.
Great choices.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Nichole, I'm going to put into the show notes how to contact Spectracell, but they are at spectracell.com. They have an Instagram account at Spectracell Labs, and their Facebook page is Spectracell Laboratories LLC. And all of this will be in the show notes with links. And Nichole, thank you so much for all of your time, all of your wisdom, and just such interesting information about what Spectracell is doing. So progressive and so important. Such a great way to fill in that missing link for many, many folks out there.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. All right, bye everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Lifestyle changes can be hard and overwhelming to make. By building your support team of functional medicine doctors, therapists, and health coaches, you can reach your optimal health goals. Be sure to check out my other podcasts. Until we meet again, stay healthy.